On behalf of the Bahá'i Chair for Studies in Development at 𝗣𝗿𝗀𝗃 University, I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists and participants who are joining us on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live for this webinar on the vital theme of mobilizing collective action to address climate change, prospects and challenges. This is the 10th in a series of webinars being organized by the chair on the impact of the grave global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change on India's most vulnerable populations. Before welcoming our panelists to share their comments, on behalf of the chair, I would like to share a few framing thoughts that have motivated us to organize this discussion. So as we know of the various ways in which human activity has upset the balance of humanity with nature, perhaps the most grave and urgent is the alarming increase of the Earth's temperature due to the emission of greenhouse gases, which, if left unaddressed, threatens the very existence of all life on Earth. The warming of the planet has already wrought havoc across the world with killer heat waves, droughts and famines, uncontrolled wildfires, and severe flooding of cities. A recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that most nations are unlikely to meet the target of net zero emissions by 2050, which would be necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Any increase above that will result in catastrophic and potentially irreversible disasters. Preventing the catastrophic consequences of climate change in the short window of time available may well be the greatest challenge that India and all of humanity faces in the 21st century, requiring drastic and urgent action involving the state, the private sector, civil society organizations, and the masses of people at the grassroots. The chair has organized this webinar to explore the implications of stimulating and sustaining collective action for the transformation of consciousness and of the systems of society that would be required to bring humanity back into balance with the natural world. Given the urgency of the issue, various national governments, including that of India, along with businesses, financial institutions, and CSOs, have committed to a path towards the difficult target of ensuring net zero emissions and adopting renewable sources of energy. Yet it is clear that to create and sustain the strong political will needed to take the decisive and drastic steps to address climate change will require a deepening and broadening groundswell of popular support. Without a mass movement of citizens who are deeply conscious of the dangers of climate change, it is going to be difficult to infuse momentum into the agenda for change or protect the agenda from vested interests. Further, the scale of the crisis calls for the masses of the world's people to play a role beyond merely extending passive support to technical solutions proposed by experts or governments. It will call for people's collective participation on an unprecedented scale as active protagonists of this process of change. The fuel that will drive this process forward will have to be the knowledge that exists and is generated on a vast scale, deriving not just from scientific institutions, but also from indigenous sources and local knowledge that people generate as they act and systematically learn from their actions. Whether mobilized through agencies of the state or through voluntary action in communities or through social movements, alliances, and networks, people in local settings would need to work together and in concert with the state, with scientific institutions, with the private sector, and with CSOs in identifying achievable milestones in the long-term process of change and in finding creative and context-specific solutions to their challenge. The need for knowledge to be generated and applied in the process of addressing climate change cannot be underestimated. Addressing the multidimensional and complex issues related to climate change in the long term will, after all, require more than just strategies for mitigation or incremental adaptation. It will call for transformational change in basic processes of life, including the way we grow food, build our homes, produce energy, and interact with the environment. This, in turn, will call for a fundamental re-examination of the values and concepts on which the existing systems of our society are built. Indeed, effective action to address climate change in its broadest contours will have to involve a recasting of social, political, and economic structure to bring them into ever greater alignment with the principles of the oneness of humankind, of justice, and of the stewardship of the Earth's natural resources. How is this level of collective consciousness and collective action for the climate to be stimulated and sustained? In an era when trust in institutions of governance has been significantly eroded, how can institutions emerge that would win the trust and provide the leadership in guiding and coordinating this movement towards change? How can those who are economically underprivileged, socially marginalized, and those who are most vulnerable to climate change participate fully in this process of change, with their perspective given priority and their interests secured? How can faith in science and commitment to moral principles guide the process of learning that would advance this process of change? What kind of institutional structures would be needed to systematize and disseminate knowledge generated in local settings? These are some of the many complex questions that we hope to explore in this webinar. Without taking more of your time, I would like to invite our first speaker to share his comments. But before that, I would like to mention to our participants on Zoom and Facebook that they can post their questions to the speakers in the Q&A box, and we will have time in between after the second speaker and as also after the fourth speaker has spoken to discuss your questions. Our first speaker today is Professor Sharat Chandra Lele. Professor Lele is a distinguished fellow in environmental policy and governance at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. So without taking more time, over to you, Professor.
Thanks, Arash. Small request, coming rather late, if you can allow me to share my screen, because I did finally decide to use a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah, got it. I hope people can see my screen. Is it visible? Okay. So thank you for this invitation and this opportunity to talk a little bit about what is obviously a very difficult subject. And it's interesting and nice to see the link between the pandemic and the larger challenge of climate change, if I may call it that, because there are many parallels, and I probably like to highlight a few of the parallels, and also the learnings from the pandemic that might make us maybe more despondent about tackling climate change, but something that we need to confront as we go towards this larger crisis, or this more longer term crisis in a sense. And so I wanted to ask, what does the COVID-19 pandemic tell us about the environment, or specifically about climate change? Right after the second wave, I was standing at, or actually right before the second wave, I was standing at the Chitrakoot Falls in Bastar district of Chhattisgarh. It's a beautiful spot. And right next to the waterfall, you will see this tree covered with bats. And as you know, bats have been held responsible, or as a possible source for transmission of the COVID-19 virus from wild nature to human beings. And so it gives us pause that here is a tourist spot, Chitrakoot Falls, visited by hundreds of people, with bats coexisting very happily with human beings there, and not transmitting viruses all over the place in any particularly large numbers. In fact, there's more than one tree there. So the narrative that as a conservation biologist or as a conservationist that I would like to paint, which would be that it is the biodiversity loss, is the fragmentation of forests, that is the primary driver of the pandemic, I think needs to be nuanced a little bit more. While the fragmentation may have contributed a little bit more to the exposure of human beings, surely, first of all, viruses are a disservice that are produced in wild ecosystems, but the pandemic is the result of something else. And I would say this image is a better representation of what drove the pandemic, which is the 𝗍𝗯𝗶𝗶𝗃𝗃. And this image is about the flights in the world in the pre-pandemic era, which I think we are almost back to this level of networking. And I think this image really shows you the incredible amount of networking, for example, between China and Europe, between Europe and North America. And therefore, the fact that the pandemic, the local disease became a pandemic and a global pandemic so fast, had actually nothing to do with the disease per se, because we've been having viruses coming out of forests and affecting people in agricultural areas, for centuries or possibly millennia. But people have had localized ways of tackling it and localized ways of essentially isolating it and keeping it there. And the connectivity was way smaller, orders of magnitude smaller in the past than it is today. And this, I think, is something that we really need to recognize, that this overdevelopment that caused the pandemic, from a localized disease problem. And so the environmentalist dilemma, as we saw during the pandemic days, was, on the one hand, we were sort of vaguely rejoicing for the visibility of the Himalayas from Chandigarh or different parts of northern India. But at the same time, we were seeing that the pandemic and the lockdown caused by the pandemic, or triggered by the pandemic, caused a huge amount of human suffering. And a lot of it was actually avoidable because of the way we handled the pandemic. It also highlighted two things. One is that the cause of environmental problems in general, and I think is true for climate change also, is the urban industrial part of our economy, including the Indian economy. And so we're no longer a rural nation, although 60% of India's people still live in the rural areas. We are no longer really a rural nation. It's the urban section which is polluting massively. That's why you couldn't see the Himalayas. And it's the urban section that is dependent enormously on the exploitation of rural labor, both by keeping them in the rural areas at low wages, but also then having them come as and when we want to urban areas without providing them the same kind of security of life and liberty and facilities in urban areas, which drove them back to their homes the moment there was a lockdown. And what was not locked down during the pandemic, as all of you remember, is the mining industry, for instance. The government gave a special exemption to the mining industry from even the first lockdown because we cannot live without the abiotic. It's something for us to remember. And it is true to an extent. If mining had actually been shut down coal minings had been shut down for 2 months, we did not have enough coal stocks to power our thermal power plants after that. So that was a sort of quote unquote genuine reason why we couldn't do, we had to give an exemption. And I think the summary message of this for me is that simple models of the environmental society relationship will not do. We need to kind of think about this even in the climate change context. And for example, the ecosystem services model that has been popularized by ecologists, saying life on Earth drives well-being, is not really a plausible model given the increased role of the urban industrial complex in converting the abiotic resource, not the ecosystem resource, not the living resource, but the abiotic resource into a driver of human well-being. And therefore, we need to recognize that and the contribution that it makes, including its contribution to pollution. And therefore, if we keep talking about ecosystems as the driver of human well-being, then we will keep pushing out this rhetoric that by restoring ecosystems, which is in very common parlance today, simply equated to planting more trees, we will somehow magically solve all environmental problems. This is one crazy scheme that is an example of that. Oxygen forests, 𝗠XX𝗶𝗶 pension scheme, or the 11 million sapling scheme floated by a well-known Baba, or the same kind of Babaji work happening at a global scale. So people say, save the earth, plant trees. And it is practically being actually proposed in this idea of nature needs half. So climate change can apparently be solved by putting half of earth under complete tree cover, which completely ignores, bypasses the question, which half of the earth are we talking about? It's not New York, Washington, or London that's going to be put in that half. It's going to be the hinterlands of all the global south, or possibly the entire global south, that's going to be put under a moratorium of no more activity, only tree planting. So I think this kind of the misunderstanding of the environment society relationship, combined with something else, which is our own worldviews about what is to be prioritized and so on, is driving these kinds of silly silver bullet solutions. They're not even silver bullets. They're not even a bullet in a sense to the problem. And so we need a deeper understanding of the nature of the problem. And we cannot talk about something as a problem unless we have a normative understanding of what is a good society. Because a problem is something that deviates, that takes us away from our notion of a good society. And the tendency is to reduce the good society understanding to simply human survival. And therefore to cast all problems as threatening human survival. The pandemic threatens human survival, climate change threatens human survival, everything threatens human survival. And since survival is a goal that everybody can agree upon, whether or not they agree upon the larger goals of a good society, so we reduce all, or we equate all environmental problems to problems of survival in order to bring about a convergence. And in the process, we kind of bypass the question of what is a good society. And therefore, what are the societal processes that prevent us from getting there, and the strategies to kind of go back towards this notion of a good society. And if you think specifically about climate change, there is a tendency to talk about climate change as the mother of all environmental problems, because it's a global environmental problem, and it's then framed as a sustainability problem. We are all in the same boat. The boat is sinking, so we all have to bail out the water. It's a sort of global commons framing which says climate change affects everybody. Every ton of CO2 emitted everywhere affects everybody, and so we are all responsible. We all need to act together. And any action towards mitigating climate change is a win-win, because it benefits you and it benefits me. It benefits everybody. So that's the attempt to sort of portray it as a CPR, a common property resource kind of frame. An alternative framing would be a justice frame, which says that the problem is a creation of the global north, which is largely true, and should be solved therefore by the global north, while we continue to grow, because we need to actually develop more. A whole 25 to 40% of our population is nowhere near living a life of dignity. So we actually need more economic growth, that is, we in the global south, while the global north is entirely responsible for mitigation. We need to go beyond this framing, and I think many colleagues have talked about it being both a sustainability problem and a justice issue, and I think that's absolutely central, because climate change, even if physically CO2 is a globally well mixed gas, the implications of higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere are not uniformly distributed across the world. Glacier melt is not happening everywhere. Coastal sea rise is happening in coastal areas. It doesn't affect the interior of a continent. A more extreme example is if the Siberian tundra or the Canadian tundra actually defreezes, it will be of benefit to those countries, whether it's Russia or Canada. And that's something to really keep in mind. These countries are actually not terribly bothered about about climate change, because it will generate a whole bunch of benefits, unlocking the resources of the permafrost areas. And therefore, the impacts of climate change are not even across the globe, even in biophysical terms, and then certainly not in social terms, because the capacity for different people to adapt and absorb these impacts also differs a lot. So there is certainly a very strong reason to think of it as a justice issue, both in its causes and as in impacts. But we need to even go beyond that and have a more radical framing of a good society as a society that aspires for a minimum level of maybe material well-being, equally important, a non-material quality of life that includes concern for non-humans, a society that is committed to equity and justice, as much as to sustainability and resilience, keeping future generations in mind. And finally, since we will all have different notions of each of these four normative goals, we will need a fifth goal, which is about process. How do we resolve differences about priorities, about definitions of equity and well-being, and so on and so forth? We will never completely agree on them, even if we broadly agree on four goals. And therefore, we need a fifth idea of a democratic process of decision-making in our life as a goal in itself. And I think this kind of a multidimensional framing of a good society is something that we really need to think about this. I'm going to skip this and just say, why are we far from this idea of a good society? There's a bunch of hidden pandemics. It's not just that we had COVID-19, and that could really be seen as a immediate calamity threatening survival. Climate change is not quite like that. It's a slow calamity. It's a slow disaster building up and affecting people very unevenly. And it's driven by a bunch of hidden pandemics, which is, on the one hand, growthism, capitalism, and a market fundamentalism that in turn feeds and drives, but is also separately related to consumerism and sort of the growth of a material culture, and long-standing problems of racism and misogyny. So the issue of gender, the issue of caste and race, and a newer problem of this faith in technology. This faith that technology can solve all problems, and we just need to allow technological innovation and in an unfettered manner. And finally, the anti-democratism that we are seeing growing across the world, including in our own country. Therefore, the lack of faith in any kind of due process, the lack of faith in any kind of participatory decision making, and looking for saviors somewhere up who will dictate to us, how we deploy technology and solve all these problems without making any other changes in our society. So, in a sense, we can think of the reason why the central goals are not being achieved is because of these larger, deeper causes, which are fundamental, which are interrelated, but also semi-independent of each other. We cannot solve the problem of, for instance, consumerist culture by only changing our internal values, because our values are shaped by the structures of the economy, the capitalism that drives consumerism through advertising and a variety of other means. And so the first message, I think, would be for us: stop watching the ticker tape which is constantly telling us that mutual funds sahi hai, directly and indirectly asking us to watch stock markets, and then blatantly telling us that we should invest our savings to grow them further, which means that we should demand a return on capital and therefore join the capitalist bandwagon, even if till now most of us were basically trying to save for the future. And so I think the first message is to stop watching the ticker tape and not get fooled by this idea of mutual funds sahi hai. The second is to start looking at our own footprints, because, and I'm talking to an audience which I think is an elite audience, even in the Indian context, and we need to start monitoring our footprints, because prices do not reflect the true environmental cost of what's going on. And you just need to peep at the backside of any such building and see the kind of explosion, for example, of air conditioning, even in a place like Bangalore, which is supposed to be the air-conditioned city of India. And I say this to this audience because I think all of us are in this top 10% of the income decile of this country. And as this work by 𝗍𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗃, my PhD student, shows, there's a dramatic increase in the carbon footprint between the 9th and 10th decile of income. So we need to be really conscious of that and not, indulge in this rhetoric that the problem is outside. It is no longer outside our country. We, the elite in India, are part and parcel of the problem. The third is, of course, the issue of democratization, because those of us who are facing the brunt of environmental pollution and who are in fact actually laboring to make this economy feasible are not us. It's not the top 10%, it's the bottom 50%. And we have failed to recognize their rights, both in the democratic process and specifically over resources, whether it is the poor implementation of the Forest Rights Act, the complete absence of a water rights and regulatory system, the gutting of the EPA and the EIA EC process that has followed, and the privatization of the mining industry, rather than moving in the other direction of actually democratizing and decentralizing the mining industry, so that whatever little surplus of the past abiotic we want to use, we will use it in a much more self-conscious and socially committed manner. And the need to create public science and engineering. Arash started the proceedings by talking about the question of knowledge. I think the question of knowledge has to be seen as a public science and engineering that is deeply embedded and driven by these environmental concerns, not fragmented along disciplinary lines, certainly not measured by citation indices and impact factors, supported by government, but not micromanaged by government, but really answerable to the public, focusing on public issues, not on private profits. And therefore, as also Arash mentioned, inclusive of layperson, craftsperson, or indigenous knowledge, not separating the Shastri from the Mistri, which is, I think, a particular characteristic of caste-ridden societies like India. And I think this question of justice, we already know, we have thought, we will continue to discuss it during the session, that we have to constantly think about the upstream and downstream relationship between those who consume and those who get polluted. And I think these 5 steps are just a preliminary set of answers to this question of the climate change crisis. Because I think what the pandemic tells us is that although it's a global crisis, whether it's the pandemic or climate change, the response does not tend to be global collective action. The response tends to be retreat into our silos, retreat into the hillocks of elite privilege that we might occupy, and let the lowly 50% look out for themselves, and therefore not share for example, the vaccines that were developed in a fair manner at all. Nor have we seen any real understanding of the cause of the pandemic, namely this crazy industrial drive to connect the whole world, to move goods and services back and forth in crazy amounts, and therefore to push more consumerism. So I think we need to link the lessons of the pandemic to understanding the climate change crisis in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharad. This was a really wonderful opening for in terms of the discussion that we're going to have today. You really helped frame the challenge that we face, and helped us see the pitfalls of a simplistic analysis of the problem, and really you took us to the heart of the question, which was identifying what it is that we are trying to move towards as our vision of a good society, and the steps that you proposed. And I'm sure it's going to be very interesting as we go along to actually begin to think of the implications of it. For example, while you were speaking, I was thinking of that one circle you had which said democracy, and how that would be the mechanism by which people would confer with each other, consult, and come to a common understanding and agree on this vision. How there's so much to be unpacked in that, because really that's so much of our, and really that's part of our discussion today, is to look at the mechanics of it. How do you get people to work together, to agree, to understand and the problem, and then to have a consensus on the path forward? I'd like to welcome our second speaker, who I think will help us think a little more about these questions. Dr. Soumya Datta. I'd like to welcome him to make his comments. He is the co-convener of the South Asian People's Action on Climate Crisis.
Thank you, Arash, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to focus on, start from what has been given as a title of this webinar, is Mobilizing Collective Action. And I will try to also bring up my conclusions based on what have been our experiences, collective experiences over the last 15 to 20 years of engaging in the climate justice movement, both in India, South Asia, and globally. And what we have the points that we have come to as a conclusion, what could be the action and who will be the agents of action. First, let's go back to when this became more or less a very visible global public understanding or public information, at least, not understanding, but public information that climate crisis is becoming a big one. This was, though these discussions were going on from the Kyoto time onwards, even before from the Earth Summit in Rio+20 Earth Summit in 2012. But actually in 2009, when the Copenhagen Climate Summit happened, that was the point where globally, even in a public domain, there was a lot of understanding, a lot of expectation, a lot of hope that something is in the expectation is something big will be done as a global community of nations. And in the nations, these were represented with the government in the UN framework, the UNFCCC framework. We all know what happened in Copenhagen. This was a massive, not only failure, this was a massive betrayal of public trust, hope, everything. And even the science that was known at this time didn't deter us from action. And the science had known at that time also told us very clearly that we are going into a very serious situation. Recently, there is a lot of commotion about the IPCC Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 reports that were released. The Working Group 1 report was released, the Assessment Report 6 was released last October, just before the Glasgow Summit, Glasgow COP26. And the Working Group 2 report was released just a few weeks before. So people are again coming back to the same, what we see, people are coming back to the same kind of a mental situation, a societal situation, and a framework that, okay, now we have been told that the Earth is facing a very serious climate crisis, and now we'll have to act. Forgetting that this same kind of warning, same kind of public action, large-scale collective action was demanded long back. Even during Copenhagen Summit, it was demanded. 2018, when the IPCC released the special report, SR 1.5, globally there was a similar kind of alarm. But what happened in when even all the governments that came together in the UNFCCC framework, 197 governments who were members of UNFCCC, most of them signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. And what was the action? And I am saying this because I really differ from the framing of this discussion, saying collective action by all stakeholders, as it was also mentioned by Aras, that all stakeholders, including state and industry, and he also mentioned private sector, state. So let me mention what happened. When the national governments, they agreed on the Paris Agreement, signed on to this, and I would like to remind that Paris Agreement goals were to keep the temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius and strive to keep it below 1.5, which is no longer possible now. Anyone who understands the science knows very well, in the next decade, we'll reach and breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius red line or the orange line, whatever you like to call it. So that is now given. Anyone who understands the science knows this. There can be ways around that to dilute that, but you cannot avoid that. But what happened after Paris is, from 2016 to 2019, global CO2 emissions along with CO2 equivalent emission has risen every year. In these 5 years from 2016 to 2020, the global financial institutions who pledged, I like to recollect, led by the World Bank, who pledged that now their commitment to climate change is irrevocable, and they will be committing roughly around 50% of their resources to climate and related, like energy transition, etc., etc. What happened in these 5 years, the global financial institutions, they actually gave $5 trillion to fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. The global governmental actions, what actually happened from 2016, 2015, the global carbon dioxide emission was around 34.6 or 34.7 gigaton. Every year it has risen to 35.4 to ultimately till 2019, something like 37.4 or 5. Only 1 year, in this next year, that was 2020, the emissions has dropped drastically. And all of us know why this has dropped drastically, because it is nothing of collective action. No collective action to actually cut down this has happened on this in a large scale. Forget about token actions here and there, smaller scales. Some companies saying that we have replaced this process with that process. Some EU governments cut down some of their emissions. That has happened. But beyond that, any collective action at a large scale, in a worldwide scale, has not really happened. And what happened post-COVID? If you look at the post-COVID recovery plans, almost all governments in their post-COVID recovery plans, and the governments did this, the industry did this, the industry bodies supported this, all of them actually supported fossil fuel-led COVID recovery. And there are major reasons for that. I'm not saying that they are doing it for pleasure. There are the kind of economy that we have built up, the way we have organized our economy, it's not very easy to shift away from fossil fuels unless we really accept that the climate crisis is an existential threat. And without accepting that, I don't think, beyond rhetorical mentioning of that, most governments and most functionaries of government really believe that. Most industries don't believe that. In fact, they are preparing their plans to safeguard or sustain their profits, sustain their increased production. Because if you look at it, and as Sarad also pointed out, and we have been facing this repeatedly, any debate in the global scale, and I have been in the UNFCCC framework, both as a civil society member, as observers earlier, and for 3 years as an advisory board member of the UN Climate Technology Center, there was tremendous, and even there was and there is tremendous resistance. The moment you talk about consumption levels, there is acceptance when you talk about efficiency. We have had this debate with the World Bank. We have had these debates with the other IFIs. We had these debates in the government sectors and universities. There is acceptance when you mention circular economy. Yes, what is circular economy? Basically, transforming a linear economy into a circular economy will reduce losses, but it will not fundamentally restructure our society or our economy, which is a fundamental need. There is tremendous resistance even at this point of time for whenever you raise the question of sustainable consumption levels. And as we know from the GDR framework, though I don't fully agree with the boundaries of the GDR framework, actually those are, the GDR framework is the Greenhouse Development Rights framework. The framework is basically right. And this also very clearly showed the connection between sustainable consumption, which are the segments of society, which countries, which societies are in a sustainable consumption level, which are not, and which segments are kept at a forced underconsumption levels. So there is tremendous resistance even after all this rhetoric of climate crisis and doing something urgent. All of us know that UN Secretary General is saying that we are sleepwalking into a disaster, and the climate crisis is running faster than we are, and we are running out of time. I'm quoting this from the UN Secretary General. But in spite of all these sayings and rhetorical utterances, the actions that the governments and the intergovernmental bodies that are showing is really not appropriate. Another point that I want to mention, when Arash again mentioned in his introduction remarks, that the net zero plans of the governments, this net zero is another big fraud. In fact, anyone who understands the science knows that net zero would have been possible if we had started 15 to 20 years ago, doing this. Today, actually countering or sequestering, reabsorbing the carbon dioxides that we emit in using either there are two methods which are being proposed and which are available. One is the biological route, one is the mechanical route, sucking out the CO2. Today, we very clearly know the biological route, we don't have enough time, enough land, enough resources to do that. The non-biological route, which is the mechanical carbon sequestration routes, there is no process in the world which is viable commercially in a large scale. Nothing has been demonstrated at scale. Only small scale demonstrations, and forget about the small Iceland example, which are very, very geology and geomorphology specific. Forgetting those few, there is no demonstrated method which has shown that it is even possible to suck out and sequester carbon dioxide at a reasonable cost at a safe level anywhere in the world. So when we are talking about net zero plans, and if you look at all the plans indices that have been submitted earlier in Paris and the improved indices that it submitted before Glasgow and in Glasgow, including India's rhetorical declaration of India has not submitted an exact plan. It's a declaration by Mr. Modi that by 2070, India will become net zero, carbon neutral. So these are all, again, basically what we are saying, I'm saying is, these are trying to fool the global public opinion, saying that the governments are acting, which they are not, saying that the corporations and the businesses are acting, which they are not. Because even now, if you look at the financing, there is a massive amount of financing, even now at this point of time, going into fossil fuels. Even now, there are massive government support that are going to fossil fuels. Just before coming to Glasgow, Mr. Biden was pleading with OPEC to increase their oil production so that the US gasoline prices, the gas prices can remain within reach of SUV drivers. Even a month before the Glasgow Climate Summit started, Mr. Johnson, Boris Johnson, was pushing hard for opening a huge oil exploration in Cambo. So, and this is not just US and UK, not just China and India, which have scuttled the coal phase out plan. And this, not to forget about that the European and American climate champions, quote unquote climate champions, they were pushing for coal phase out while not uttering a single word for oil and gas phase out. So all these are being done to fool the global public opinion. So in my understanding of following and deeply engaging with the climate justice movement over the last 15 to 20 years, there is only one kind of collective public, collective large action possible, and that's very difficult, and that's people's uprising. I'll not use another word for that, but without a large-scale people's uprising, this is not going to happen, and we are more or less committed to go into possibly a runaway climate change situation in the next decade. So I'll end by saying this, that collective action, including governments and industry and business, will not happen on their own at all. It will only happen if there is a public global uprising, and that uprising forces the governments and the industry to completely change track, because we are not talking about incremental improvements. We are talking about fundamental restructuring of our economies, fundamental restructuring of our societies, and that is not going to be led by governments and industries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Soumya, for this, for raising such pertinent questions. I would like to also welcome our participants to please share their questions and comments for the speakers in the Q&A box. So I just wanted to pick up on something that Soumya just shared and connect it with Sharad's earlier comments. So we understand that the way things are kind of in a sense we are stuck in the position in which we are because of the structures that exist, and that like he said, we need a fundamental structural change without which it's really difficult to think of a radical, like if to take what Sharad was saying, a radical new conception of a good society. So then when one thinks of that and one sees that structures, there are vested interests, they are complicit with each other, and somehow even any movement towards change will be compromised, undermined. So then one thinks of then where is the locus of the energy, the movement, the vision going to come from? And like Soumya said, the answer clearly has to be the people, because who's going to be the ones who will really drive this movement for change forward? Not those who stand to gain from the existing system. They are only going to postpone any possibility of change. But then the question comes of how is that to come about? And it goes back, I go back to this earlier question, which I was asking, or actually a comment which I posed to Sharad, which is this question of democracy. Because you see, one of the reasons why world leaders cannot stop this tiger of economic growth which we are riding, they can't rein it in, is because of the way democracy works. Every 5 years they have to go back to the people, and if there is no economic growth, if they don't constantly produce, at least the way it is now, they don't talk about growing GDP and more jobs and prices. They don't put a lid on prices, constantly escalating. They don't give more facilities, electricity. People are not going to support them, and so there are some structural contradictions to democracy itself. On the one hand, the system we have makes leaders think in the short term, and there's a certain short-termism which comes into play. On the other hand, we say that the only way to get people to, take charge is by them really coming out and taking ownership of this challenge that they face. So I don't know if either of you or even the other two panelists have any thoughts on this. How does one break out of this in terms of the unleashing this capacity and the energy and the momentum that is needed to really bring about change? How does one unleash it? How does one ensure that it is coordinated, that it again does not get derailed, does not get co-opted by vested interests? And so that's my question. Going back to Soumya, like, can you completely keep structures of governance out? Can you may say that the market is has completely emasculated government, and the state is not going to really stand up to the market, but then one still needs, one can't get away from the need for leadership, for coordination, for mobilization. And where is that going to come from? See, in other words, where is the democratic gap going to be filled? From where is that going to emerge? Sorry, yes, please go ahead.
See, the final answer to this is with no one, because if we had the final answer of how really this change will come up, then we'd have already started a revolution, if not an uprising. So the final answer is definitely not with us. All of us are trying. But one thing is there is like the questions that you raised. Some of these presupposes that the situation that we are in now and the systems that have been given to us were always existing, which were not. This kind of continuous, if you look at history, a little bit of history, if you go back 2000 years of economic history, from just last 2000 years, you look at the kind of per capita income growth, you will see till around, and this is a very famous chart, 2000 years of economic history in one chart. I'll recommend everybody to look at it. I don't have the access to that right now, but it's a very famous chart. If you see that for almost 1700 years, and I'm not going back beyond that, even into further history, but even those 1700 years, there was hardly any per capita GDP growth, whereas the population increased. Obviously, after the invention and spread of agriculture, population started increasing rapidly, but there was hardly any per capita GDP growth. People's living standards improved slowly, and this concept of rapid economic growth, that your GDP has to grow every year at 5%, 6%, 7%, this is a very recent creation. This is a narrative created by earlier. There was some consensus on that, but the Washington Consensus, 1944, was an instrumental year, an instrumental sort of mechanism in creating a global consensus that this is the desired way to grow, and this is the way economies globally has to be organized. And I think people might have read about the creation of a consensus that how it works, how Noam Chomsky wrote about it. So I think once we accept that, we'll say, how do we go out of that? But if you look at it, there is already in Europe, there are a lot of debates, discussions on degrowth. People already accept that societies which are over-consumers, they have to degrow. They don't need to grow. In fact, they cannot grow economically. They have to degrow, not stagnant, degrow. There is also an accepted notion of redistributive growth, because the people, the segments of population which really don't have enough, like Sharad mentioned, which are actually, I call them forced under-consumers. They are not under-consumers by choice, but they don't have any choice to even consume, even buy and consume. The minimum needs that they need, are essential needs that are needed to for a dignified life, for a normal life. So there is concept of degrowth. There is a very well-known concept of redistributive growth, but the dominant narrative today is GDP growth. And we have been told that without a continuously growing economy, you cannot have the goodies. If we look at it, just let me give an example. This will be illustrative. You talked about electricity. How much electricity per capita an US citizen consumes? 12,700 kilowatt hours per hour. How much electricity per capita an average Indian citizen consumes? Around 1,200. How much a Bihar citizen consumes? Around 170. And how much a Delhi citizen consumes? Around 2,100. And Delhi is a fairly rich city by Indian standards. Delhi's people, even in the slums and jhopri-jhaggis, have electricity, now has free electricity, even middle class have free electricity. So if Delhi, with extreme temperatures of both cold and hot, they can comfortably live with 2,100 units per person per year, why should a US citizen need 12,700 units per year? So these questions need to be asked. We don't raise this question, and this is very well connected with the global situation. Today we know we have a global ecological footprint available. The maximum is 12.92 billion global hectares. Today our consumption level is 1.76 times that. That means we are eating 1.76 Earths every year. This year on July 29th or July 28th, the entire Earth's production capacity, biocapacity and entire biocapacity, not the non-renewable, but the renewable production capacity, including production and waste recycling, will be consumed by human societies, human economies by July 29th or 30th. After that, what we will be doing is cutting the earth and eating it. So this cannot be sustainable. So the question of this GDP has to grow. If something is destructive, if you are going to eat a bomb, then you have to diffuse and throw out the bomb. You cannot keep saying the bomb is there to eat, so I'll have to eat. That's a self-defeating argument. But that's exactly the argument we have been fed, and we are accepting that GDP has to grow. No, GDP do not have to grow. There is more than enough production. There is more than enough money in the world to serve everyone in the world sufficiently. And those who go beyond that reasonably sustainable level, they have to be cut in. So this is a very hard choice. And there also the question of democracy. How can you cut someone's share in a democracy? Don't you, in a democracy, we don't have a right to throw my garbage in your house. That's not democracy. Democracy don't mean unfettered, unrestricted rights. Democracy also gives your responsibilities and restricts your rights when it conflicts or contradicts with others' rights. So we'll have to internalize those things.
Thank you.
It's very much possible.
Yeah. No, please. Okay. Sharad, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit because I don't disagree with Soumya at all. So, but I do want to add another twist which maybe make things more complicated, which is that in this gradient of 170 units in Bihar, or what, maybe even 500 units per capita, and 2,100 in Delhi and 12,000 in the US. The problem is that the Bihari is aspiring for Delhi, while the Delhi wala is aspiring for the US. And there is no way of there's no easy way to signal to the Bihari that even 2100 might be unsustainable, and equally no easy way to signal to the Delhi wala that 12,000 is unsustainable. And I don't think it is only because of the rhetoric of GDP growth, because the common person doesn't understand GDP growth. What they look for is increased bijli, sadak, pani kind of rhetoric. And this is driven by the idea of technology will solve your problem. You just need to get that technology to you. Now it is ghar ghar pe pani. Now it is something else. Now it is something else. You're entitled to all of this. You're, is a way of keeping the populace happy. But the key, the transformation that Soumya mentioned between agrarian societies and industrial society is not just the growth in a GDP rhetoric. It is the actual role of the stored abiotic resources, primarily fossil fuels, but then also fossil fuels enable us to liberate iron ore and bauxite and a whole bunch of other mineral resources at a scale that is completely unimaginable in an agricultural society. Even if we had an iron age that was during the agricultural period, that iron age simply meant we knew how to handle a little bit of iron ore, but not extract iron ore on this kind of ridiculous scale or crazy scale. And I think that transformation we need to recognize. It's not just the rhetoric of economic growth goes hand in hand, or capitalism in general goes hand in hand with the fossil fuel based technological revolution. And the challenge that poses is that everybody has sipped from that cup. I may have sipped only a little bit. I have driven a motorcycle, and I know that it is 10 times easier than riding a bicycle for 20 kilometers. My neighbor has a car, so that person has tasted a car, and somebody else has tasted a flight. There's no clear indication along this gradient. Even when I shift from a bicycle to motorcycle, I have no way of knowing its environmental consequence, because the drilling for oil is happening in Saudi Arabia, and the impact is happening at a global scale. The CO2 is distributed across the globe. I do not visually see the impact of my fossil fuel consumption in a way which was very different from an agrarian society, where if I cut down the forest recklessly to make way for agriculture, I actually saw some of those consequences in terms of soil erosion coming into my fields and making the forest unproductive and so on and so forth. So this direct sense of what the environmental consequences of my actions are, direct both in time, that is immediate, and in space, that is I can actually see it and not externalize it on somebody else, 2,000 kilometers away, as in the case of Jharkhand producing electricity for Delhi, is central to the environmental problem. That we are able, this technological revolution has created the distance between the consumer and the producer, so that the consumer does not see the environmental consequences. Neither the Juggiwala in Delhi nor the elite of Delhi or New York see the consequences of what they're doing. And so this doesn't mean to let them off the hook, certainly not the elite, but it does make the issue complicated. That's all I want. There's also a question in the chat box, which is more about the collective action point that you made, Arash. So I'll just quickly respond to that question, which is, I fully agree with the person who's saying, how can we, if the state led us into the green revolution or the blue revolution, how can we now suddenly ask people to do the next revolution? And this point Soumya has already made. It is not about letting the state. I think if by collective action we mean people somehow do it on their own, that's not the idea. I think collective action to put pressure on our structures of governance to bring about this radical transformation. We cannot do it on our own. And that's also the response, I think, to Arash, your question of democracy, which is that we will not be able to do it with the kind of democracy we have today. We'll have to radically restructure our democracy into a much more participatory democracy, much more decentralized democracy than we have it today. Your point was absolutely right. Today, the democracy is at such a scale, so far removed from the realities of local people, that they can spin stories about more sadak, more bijli, more pani, and get away with votes cast in a particular political economy. And we have to restructure our democracy radically. Thank you.
Yeah, that's thank you so much for these comments. I mean, it also made me think of the role of to have the kind of democracy that would really lead to the kind of changes we are talking about. There's also the question of how does one empower citizenry. so that they are able to understand the issues that they face. They are able to use knowledge, use the methods of science to analyze, to understand, and not be manipulated, because so much of our problem with democracy is that it's been taken over by these instruments of manipulation and propaganda. And so somehow that's also part of the bigger picture. Anyway, not to complicate, make more complex an already complex picture, I want to go more into the questions now. Maybe let's now go to the next speaker on our panel. I would like to invite Sridhar Ramamurthy, who is an earth scientist and a managing trustee with Environics Trust, to please make his comments.
Thank you, Harsh, and thanks Sharad and Soumya for laying a very strong background on various things. Can I share my presentation? Are you able to see my presentation? Yeah.
Yes, Sridharji.
Yeah. What I feel is today, it's not just the climate crisis, like the runaway climate crisis, which is already impacting billions. Soumya said, we are going to have a runaway climate crisis. I think we are already on that kind of a path with significant erratic and extreme events. And it is already impacting, billions of people in Asia, what we see in Philippines, what we see in Indonesia, and also in coastal India. Now East and West Coast both are vulnerable to annual cyclones. The second is a huge, the economic crisis. While we are talking about a climate crisis, there's a huge debt burden, of all the countries. And, like the Americans, everyone cannot print dollars and keep working on it. And a 2000, if not, the kind of Great Depression of the 1930s, a meltdown of the kind of 2008 is not very far away, according to some of the more, knowledgeable economists. And if we look at India itself, 10 lakh crores of non-performing assets in the last count of the industry itself, which is being paid back by poor in terms of bank charges or other kind of things and haircuts to public banks. Then we have a crisis in work, and especially post-COVID, where we are finding, in the mining sector, I'm seeing huge mechanization. People are moving from 10-ton dumpers to 100-ton dumpers. Then robotics, artificial intelligence, and these are going to change, as we call Industry 4.0. It's dramatically going to change the nature of work. And like others also pointed out, the whole crisis of capital. There is a very unequal ownership and access. There is very large scale transfer of public capital to private capital in terms of wealth. Then there are extremely skewed worker to owner incomes, even in modern sectors like software. So what we are finding today is there is climate vulnerability, and there is the vulnerability of globalization. So suddenly Chinese are able to make manjas and kites. So the kite makers and manja makers of Bareilly are losing jobs. So you're finding this globalization vulnerability and climate vulnerability are together going to kind of impact people. While we have other kind of problems in our kind of society of social vulnerability in terms of discrimination, various other kind of things. So we have so if we broadly look, we have some huge areas of our country which are vulnerable to both of these kind of climate change and as well as globalization. So these impacts are going to be very severe, and already we are seeing, whether it is malnutrition, extreme malnutrition in parts of Bundelkhand, or we are finding coastal communities being disturbed every year. But what is the reality that's going on in this current era of privatization, globalization, and rapid transformations of the economy? Particularly in developing countries, there is a threat to the livelihood, especially of those who have been dependent on that and who had traditional rights and control over them. There is a significant trend of curtailing the rights of common people. Like for instance, the auction on mineral resources are being done electronically between the state and the industrialist or the company, and the people whose land or where they are living, who will eventually be thrown out of that place, are not even informed in the first place. And this is happening not only with mineral resources, but large-scale projects and also infrastructure, especially after infrastructure itself, which was seen as a public good, has now become a asset class by itself, which can be owned, like roads can be owned or airports can be owned. The wave of globalization, liberalization has clearly favored the large corporate sector, and they have been able to consolidate their over mega interventions, which is undermining several landscapes and the very survival of local communities. So who are the current beneficiaries? If we see, they are the investors and the investment bankers who are sitting, somewhere in maybe in one of these tax havens. Then there are the owners and managers. There are the politicians and contractors, the researchers, consultants, even civil society organizations, government departments, officials, and in the case of mining or even on the case of non-performing assets, the kind of reclaimers. For instance, very recently, if you see many of the steel plants that went kaput or power plants that went kaput, the new owners bought them at almost 1/4 or 15% of the original cost. Who are paying the cost? The local communities in each places are paying the cost. The workers are paying the cost. The local environment is paying the cost. The ecosystem is getting destroyed, and even the small investors, like the most recent Paytm or cryptos are showing, or even in the stock market, the small investors are losing out. In summary, the current development model is economically lucrative for the industry. It is generating marginal values for the state, and impoverishes a large section of the communities. It's environmentally unsound and destroys the ecosystem, and in most cases warranting public action, and legal action, as it is not according to the norms also. And slowly communities and even countries are losing their own self-reliance. Today we need to get pulses from Mozambique and edible oil from across the world. And what we are finding that, and the way the governments are going in for investments, we don't seem to be having self-reliance in the kind of investments we can make. And it's very grossly inequitable. Corporate gains versus locally displaced people, or top executives to contractual workers and informal workers. So in the economic world of the capitalist era, even bankruptcy, every bankruptcy enhances corporate wealth. That's why, when Raghuram Rajan spoke in IRMA, he said, we have many sick companies, but we don't have sick promoters. So what do we need to collectively work upon, which is the theme of today's. So one is, how do we delay this destructive processes? And how the risks to workers, work and scope, and how do we scope reskilling? how do we address this ownership patterns and institutional design? How do we define this just transition based on all aspects? How can we bring in community and workers convergence? How do we bring movements and trade union convergence? How do we address issues at global, regional, national, and local levels? Because at the moment, you step out of the country and you say, there has to be common but differentiated responsibilities. So the government says, yeah, all of you must shout for it. So you go to a COP and you talk about it. When you come back home, you find the same kind of thing, practiced by your own state, right? What is asking there, it is not doing it here. And then we need to look at a pragmatic process to ensure this transition. So actually what we have been trying to do is, how do you denigrate this model of development? How do we deliberate and then develop what are the alternatives? To delay, we are using, the kind of corruption that is taking place. How do you highlight that? The illegalities, whether it is, economic, whether it is, for instance, in the recent auctions for coal mines, when we tried to do a preliminary fit and proper person test, none of the companies were fit or proper to enter into auction, because all of them had either been economic violator or an environmental or a social violator. Then how do you deal with issues of displacement, environmental degradation, the violence and insurgency that is developing, and the human rights violation? So this kind of issues, when you raise, it delays the process of this destructive projects, which enables to gain time for us and the communities to look at what are the kind of alternatives. Then how do you denigrate? You can't just say, I don't like it, because we need to do research and documentation. That is where, when you said in your initial remarks, how scientists, others come into play on this. Then how do we engage with the regulators? Today, the regulators are all blind, whether they are the State Pollution Control Board or even SEBI or the National Stock Exchanges. So we, the amount of money that since liberalization we would have lost to scams must have made us one of the richest countries in the world if it had all been trapped. Then how do we fast track this change, and also, take strong investor action? How do we ensure that those who have money and investing in these kind of programs, so we have to force a moratorium on this kind of current ways of destruction, and look forward to how we can find new this thing. So what do we do? Revocation of public sanction, highlight shared inheritance. For instance, in minerals or natural resources, that it is not ours. We inherited from our future generations. Then not only that, how can we rationalize mineral use? For instance, the government itself accepts the top 60 coal mines would provide all the coal that we need. But we are pockmarking with 400 coal mines. One bauxite deposit can actually provide for all the aluminum that we are producing. But once again, we have got, wherever an investor wants to come and dig, we are willing to give that. So how can we rationalize this? And how can we engage everyone in this process? So we have to also concurrently develop enabling activity, highlight the advantages of these alternatives. And as my previous speakers also said, it has to be numerous and plural when we say democratic. And then it has also to be led by communities. So to enable communities in their regions to implement local alternatives. So I look forward to some collective action, and maybe some questions I would be willing to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sridhar. That was a very thought-provoking presentation, also building on a lot of what we were discussing earlier. I would really like to hear more from those last few slides where you talked about local alternatives and community action. But maybe during the question answer session, and you also talked about, but you didn't really describe the I don't know what word I can't remember, but community worker convergence. So it would help. It would help to hear more and to learn from your experience and insights in this regard.
Yeah,
but we can do it when we open the floor for discussion. But before that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Ms. 𝗠𝗿𝗶𝗵𝗃𝗲, who is a senior manager with climate at the World Resources Institute. I'd like to invite her to share her comments.
Sridhar, could you switch off your screen share?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So good afternoon, good evening to everyone. And thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's been such a delightful conversation, even though, of course, we realize the scale and the stickiness of this problem that we are talking about. So in what I will speak, I think what I'll do is limit myself to the few interventions on what, as researchers and civil society, what we could do rather than what needs to happen across the board, which clearly is of a massive scale and it's very sort of difficult and tricky. So I'll begin by saying that, meeting our collective developmental and economic goals, which clearly we need to question. So while ensuring that we avoid the worst impacts of climate change will require concerted efforts in the way in which we use power and make power, in what goods we consume and how we produce them, and also in the larger sort of choices that we have in terms of our lifestyles and consumption. But such changes can no longer be just incremental and would basically entail a structural and systemic shift across the board. So the first point I basically want to make is that given that we need to realign or rein in our emissions in line with what the IPCC recommends currently, the changes that we need to do have to be done at a much faster pace. And secondly, that this transformational change that we are envisaging will also eventually impact communities and people, as well as the ecology and environment that we lived in. And unless we plan and implement them by considering the full range of impacts across social and environmental dimensions, these themselves can lead to perpetuating and exacerbating the existing social and economic inequities, as well as cause further ecological damage. So therefore, what is needed is not just to transform, but to ensure that this transformation and this transition takes place faster and it ensures better outcomes for all actors. However, so far what we've seen is that the conversation has largely been top-down, technology-centered. It has been revolving around building an economic case for moving in the right direction, and has therefore been basically a slow and long-drawn political process with private sector interests at the forefront. However, what is needed is to change the discourse of climate action to acknowledge and integrate more meaningfully the interconnectedness of our lives, the nature, and the economic activities that we undertake. We also need to ensure that people are kept at the center in order to ensure that the transition is just and equitable and resilient. But how can these considerations for people be included without people themselves playing a greater role in this transition? And well, this has been the wicked collective action problem that we are talking about and we are familiar with. I will spend, like I said, a few minutes to talk about how people like us could sort of help change these narratives. And to do that, I'll first outline three things that I think we need to be wary of when we talk about collective change, and then talk about a couple of things that we need to do and work towards. So the first thing I think we need to be wary of is shifting the responsibility on masses and individuals. So a lot of research, and in fact, very specific research done by a few researchers has shown how companies like ExxonMobil have worked to keep the conversation about climate solutions focused on the consumer, which effectively individualizes the responsibility for the problem. And they are not the only ones who try to push these narratives. Even the notion of a personal carbon footprint was popularized by another oil firm, BP. But ultimately, what these narratives do is they hamstring us and put these blinders on us, which sort of prevent us from looking at the systemic nature of the climate crisis and discourage any possibility of collective action to address the problem. So basically, it cannot be boiled down to 7 billion people shifting to paper straws and ditching plastic bags, which is essentially doomed for failure even at the outset. What we in fact need is to ensure that people are aware of the systemic nature of the change that is needed, and then to be able to demand that such change happens, because that would be critical. The second thing to be wary of is limiting our discussions to technology and making an economic case for action. So while researchers like us and economists at large have been trying to identify ways and technologies and policies, as well as the benefits of climate action, which is essential, there also needs to be a realization that climate action will also come at a cost. It will require massive investments, the returns of which may take time to pay off. It will also entail huge financing requirements, and the benefits of climate action, which even though may be net positive as we like to aggregate everything, they will also entail significant negative impacts or costs. And these will be of magnitudes which we are not even considering at the moment. Therefore, limiting our discussions only to viable technologies and these win-win business cases and net positive increases in GDP will essentially limit our climate action to the pace and scale that we have been seeing. So instead, what we need to do is to be aware of such challenges and look for creative ways in which to use policy measures to make unviable technologies viable, to realign business goals to look beyond profits, and to redistribute the aggregate benefits that we sort of are aiming towards more equitably. Which brings me to the third thing to be wary of, which is in sort of reducing our emissions, we don't want to create another problem while solving climate change. So we need to be wary of perpetuating, like I said, existing inequities, because we already live in a highly inequitable world. So we saw how consumption patterns differ, incomes differ, and these inequities are across social, economic, and gender groups. And they're already present in all societies in varying degrees. And in addition, conventional technologies have long destroyed the significant natural and ecological systems. But climate solutions like large-scale utility solar and the likes, while reducing GHGs, may actually perpetuate these inequities or divert ecological resources due to its demands for large amounts of land as well as water. So how can climate solutions be implemented is another conversation we need to have, because this will eventually help build collective support for such solutions from people, rather than people experiencing climate solutions also as yet another hurdle that will eventually discourage public action towards mitigation. So then what should be done, especially like by people like researchers like myself? So the first step, I believe, is to educate the public at large and at the grassroots. And I don't mean to really use this word educate in the more patronizing manner of telling people what they already know, because each one of us, and especially people at the grassroots, are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. But rather, I believe what we could do is give them the vocabulary and the information that is needed to help make the linkages between what they already know to be happening to the larger policies and discourse in the public realm, to help make the linkages to the kind of systems and processes that drive emissions as well as reductions beyond just turning off of lights. So this does not mean necessarily dumbing down of content, because I don't believe we really need to do that. I mean, we remember how each one of us became pandemic experts in 2020. So it's not just that the masses only need simplified language and concepts, but rather they need information and content that can help them link what they are experiencing to what needs to change and what they can do about it. So what this means is to then inform a rich discourse rooted in science, but simple and clear in its messaging. What it also means is sustained communication beyond key moments, such as when IPCC releases new reports or when COP happens once a year. And what we also need is to focus on actions and solution-oriented takeaways rather than just highlighting the challenges. The second thing I believe we need to actively work towards is to enable inclusive climate action. And I think the speaker before me sort of also spoke about this. So what we really need to think about is not just what needs to be done, but how it needs to be done, to not only work on technological solutions, but also governance and policy making processes to recommend changes and create avenues for engagement with communities. What this may mean is to create a platform for the voice to voice the concerns of communities, to showcase experiences of those who are being affected, as well as to demonstrate community level solutions that may have hope. And this platform and voice needs to transform beyond just informing policy to actually shaping and co-creating climate policies and action, which means it will need to be like a real seat at the table, which currently only the industry enjoys, despite being the biggest perpetrator of emissions and driving excessive demand. So therefore, we need to find ways to organize these collective voices and improve their representation and integrate them in a real way in policymaking. So the third thing that I might want to suggest is to help create policies and solutions that actually empower people to make better choices, and to empower people not only to vote once in 5 years for the leaders who shape their policies, but also create choices for them in the day-to-day. For example, expecting people to buy expensive and sustainably made products is naive and also classist. So the idea that we can individually choose to go for a low carbon transportation system is essentially blaming the victim for the real decisions that actually make a difference, which is how we structure our cities, how we set energy policy, what kind of roads and safety is available for people to choose something like a bicycle, and what is the cost of such modes of transport. So if essentially individual choices will mostly count when the economic system can provide them with viable choices, and not just for the affluent people to make these switches. So eventually what this means is working on solutions or research that expands this range of viable choices. And that would be the first step in empowering people to own the solutions and therefore feel more connected to the solutions. Such people would be more likely to participate in collective action efforts that eventually can bring about the systemic change and hold leaders and private sector accountable. And finally, this is a point I thought of adding at a much later point, but I don't think we can talk about collective action without the role of climate activism or climate activists. And I decided to add this because I came across this research which essentially establishes something that they're calling the Greta Thunberg effect, which says that those who are more familiar with Greta Thunberg have a stronger sense of collective efficacy, which is the belief that through working together with like-minded others, they can actually reduce global warming. And in turn, they have then higher intentions of taking collective actions to reduce global warming. So this study also says that this effect is similar across age groups as well as across liberal or conservative groups. So therefore, in our efforts to bring forth the research and science and processes, we must remember to also give space to such voices and sort of bring into the fold public figures and icons, rather than limiting the conversations with heads of states and technical experts and CEOs. Because popular public figures could then potentially mobilize masses, enhance this collective consciousness and the belief in collective action, and therefore motivate further collective action. So let me just wrap it up by saying that while I don't think these points that I made are either easy or sufficient, but I really think there's a greater role, that there's an important role that researchers and civil society can play in building the necessary linkages between what is currently a highly technocratic discourse of the issues and solutions to a more people-centric discourse, to look beyond only impacts at the aggregate level, to also look at impacts on communities, individuals, and especially vulnerable groups. And finally, to engage meaningfully, not just with policymakers and businesses, but also with the public, and to create linkages between them so that the process is more inclusive and therefore sort of leads to that level of accountability and action that we all would like to see. So let me just stop here and be happy to discuss this further.
Thank you so much, Ashwini, for this very succinct but very insightful contribution. I think there's a lot here that you've contributed, which needs to be unpacked. Probably some of the threads we can discuss in the discussion time that we have for leftover. I found this in terms of what should be done. You mentioned about the role of education, and this was something that I was also thinking about before from the earlier speakers. So I was grateful that you actually went a little deep into it. But one question that comes to mind is, before Sharad was talking about how, there are consumers at different levels in terms of electricity. We have that analogy, and then how does one get one consumer to basically accept to consume less. So the question that comes to mind is, on the one hand, there is information that you were talking about, and specific knowledge that one educates. One doesn't dumb down the discourse. One, you have to respect the capacity of people and their capacity to understand the complexity of the issues. But then there is something at the level of values which comes in, which somehow there's no getting away from that question. I mean, even when one looks at the economic aspect, where the second point that you said we need to be wary of, which is this tendency to make an economic case for it. Well, part of it is because that is the predominant frame in which our society thinks. Like Sharad was in his presentation talking of, this capitalist, consumer, materialist civilization. He didn't use that word, but anyway, that's kind of. So part of, yes, there is one aspect of education which has to do with imparting knowledge, with know-how, information that is scientific in nature. But then there's also something which has to do, and I think it goes to the crux of all that we've been saying, which is how does one bring about this change in terms of values, whether it be in the context of consumption, in the context of democracy, deepening democracy. There's no getting away from the need for a collective transformation, if you will, at the level of what we value as a society, and being willing to, like I think Sridhar was mentioning that in his comments, which is you have to also be willing to face the consequences of, or like you were saying, the cost of climate action, which again cannot happen if you don't value what's happening with a different lens. So I don't know, it's again one of those wicked problems, and but I just wanted to throw it out. If there's any comments you have, anyone would like to speak.
Just one. I mean, it's not a very well thought out point at this point, but well thought out argument at this point. But I really believe that at the core of this whole aspiration that we are trying to redefine, right? That person in Bihar wants to be at the level of the person in Delhi, and the Delhi person wants to be at the level in America. I think that is what needs to be changed, and somehow I feel like this capitalist sort of system has convinced us of a particular thing, and probably as a community who wants to mobilize climate action, we need to do the same. I mean, we have to make these things aspirational, basically. Like, we need to make it cool to own a cycle. So, and this may seem like, I don't know, just sort of buying into this narrative, but effectively, that if that works, I think that could be just one way of moving or shifting the conversation from just excessive demand or excessive consumption to be aspirational, but also there's another pathway that could be made sort of more aspirational. But yeah, that's just one submission.
Thank you so much. Sharad, were you going to say something? I saw your video turn on.
Well, I was just going to add to the very nice points that Ashwini made, and also before that, Sridhar. So Sridhar, in your slide about who's losing, you mentioned broadly a whole set of people. I wanted to highlight there the question of women. Because even today when I work in the forests of Bastar, and we see a society in transformation, a predominantly Adivasi society that is undergoing rapid transformation with the penetration of roads, motorcycles, cars, and electricity, subsidized by the state for a particular reason, so that they can be kept calm while the bauxite is mined and the iron ore is mined and so on, right? So you see that even in a situation where the men are roaming around on motorcycles, the women are walking 5 to 10 kilometers to collect firewood, as the village forests are depleted and they go to the next village and the village after that and so on. So I wanted to just, I'm sure you had that in mind when you said, who's losing, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that. And Ashwini's point about how do we bring about the transformation? I think Arash's question, I feel we need to scratch our heads a little bit more, because two things. One is, some of these values we have not held as a society. I think values of social justice and equity, we have not deeply held in our society. Adivasi societies were holding them at some level within their own ethnicities, and while there was still a lot of inter-ethnic conflict and so on. So even that was kind of limited. The issue of gender justice, for instance, we see Adivasi cultures were more gender equitable than non-Adivasi cultures, and that's true, but only to a limited extent. And there was still a fair amount of gendering of roles and women's exploitation even there. And so we have not held many of these values. And the second thing is that these values seem to be very ephemeral. So the idea of community, for instance, which is very strong in certain cultures even today, sort of seems to disappear the moment we latch on to goods that enable us to individualize. It is amazing how ephemeral these values seem to be. So we talk about a value that's taken 1,000 years or thousands of years to evolve can disappear overnight when technologies enable you to live in your own cocoon and just watch Netflix the whole night and work on the internet or whatever it is, right? So I'm just saying that can science help by sort of foregrounding the point that we are actually interconnected, we are actually interdependent. We're just not seeing those interdependencies because they're happening now at a different scale. That can be the role of science, because the earlier idea of community was connected to the fact of interdependence, that you had to live together if you had to survive in a fairly hostile environment. Now suddenly that hostility has disappeared. You seem to be in the Anthropocene in complete control of the environment in a very individualized kind of way. So I just wanted to add that, saying, yes, I think there is an interplay between science and values, even though I do not want to sound like science leads you to the right values. Absolutely not. Science leads you to the atomic bomb also. So absolutely no such illusions, but we can play a role.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah, you are simple, well taken, and my more elaborate presentation has more granular whoever is getting affected, and also who are getting benefited among the people, also more granular in that. Thanks, Ashwini, for bringing out certain ways by which engagement can be brought with policymakers. But most often what we are finding is the dialogue with policymakers seem to happen only in the courtroom, because the way the influence currently of I think that we, from an era of crony capitalism, we have gone to an era of crony politics. So you don't see any, earlier you could go to even a parliamentary standing committee to take your issues and try and identify what kind of solutions could be, or you could go to a planning commission and say, how do we look at next 20 years. But today, unless in most cases that I also mentioned in my presentation, unless you drag them to the court and provide evidence saying that the kind of destructions they are doing, or So that space, is kind of shrinking. And also, today they don't even, most recently, they've also mentioned that civil society is like the fourth estate of war, right? So when a state does not want, kind of this thing, it's going to be more and more difficult. And that is when, one sees that, what Soumyada says, that, you have to have a revolution, or you have to have some massive, kind of people's reprisal of these kind of situations. Only then there will be some change. But what we have also seen is that, both it is testing the endurance. We saw in the farmers' agitation. We are seeing now, even today, like as I talk today, there are people arrested in Orissa. One case where the railways want to build a line where they don't want to adhere to any of the recommendation of the Scheduled Tribe Commission, which has said that according to law, according to the rule, they have to be given jobs, or their compensation has to be so much. Without even getting into that question, they have brought in police, and they are saying that they've even, without any injury to any policeman, they have, slapped Section 307, saying that there is an attempt to murder of officials. Same as what for 2 decades people are fighting in Dinkia, that is where earlier POSCO was to take this land, the whole beetle farming communities in coastal Orissa. 2 decades they have been fighting. Now, a new corporate has become cozy with the political powers. So JSW has been given everything, where the appraisal committees go to write long minutes in order to enable the company to go ahead with the project. And if 10 years ago the courts and the government held that these were important forests and should not be given for steel plant, how come 10 years later, if you make the appropriate papers, does it change the environmental or ecological situation? So we have what I'm essentially drawing to is to create spaces for this policy dialogue itself would be an important and major task. And I think there is a huge role for a lot of scientific and social institutions to get this spaces secured. Otherwise, the people who are really getting, who are bearing the brunt, are not going to have any voice at all.
Yes, Sharath, yes, please.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box that I was hoping other colleagues on the panel would also be able to respond. The same person has asked a series of linked questions, which to me in a nutshell is asking, if human beings are fundamentally egocentric, then what is the hope for revolution or any of the other things that we are talking about? That Soumyada has said, we're going to need some uprising of a kind. And I think that, to me, it's sort of like we don't have the luxury of making these assumptions about human beings as only egocentric or only selfish. We have to believe, and we have to ask those questions of ourselves all the time, whether we are or are not living up to higher ideals. But we have to believe that people are capable of a different value system. There have been many instances of that in the past, and there are many people today who still, subscribe to a different set of values than just egocentrism. The challenge for us is to create the space. Just to pick up on Sridhar's last point, the space where people think for themselves and are able to retain a value system beyond the egocentric. In today's world, these structures are such that people who elect Gram Panchayat leaders see that an extremely selfish and egocentric leader rises to the top, given the particular structures of the political and economic system. And the rest of the people are left by the wayside, and they have no downward accountability. The leaders have no downward accountability. creating that space and fighting to change the structure, create that space. I think the structure is influencing so much of the value system today. That it's both changing value systems and obscuring those who hold different values or disempowering. But I hope others have better suggestions than this.
So my simple thing is when valuations become important, which everyone is running towards valuations and becoming, unicorns. I think values are shortchanged, and that's what is happening currently. I think Soumyada wants to say something.
Yes, I had a couple of brief comments. One, I fully agree with Ashani when she said that this individual choices and decision making on individuals and their positive action. This is a very clearly a corporate agenda. This has been, as she rightly said, BP created this carbon footprint concept, and O&M had been given contract to popularize it. And many of our colleagues, of course, we also did this 10, 12 years ago. We taught even from Sridharji's group, some people came, you remember, we taught them how to do this carbon footprint analysis, etc. But these are very clearly agendas of the corporates, which, as she rightly said, that you put the responsibility on the individuals rather than on the system and the main culprits. But when you talk about educating people, and then that education will lead to more sort of liberating action. I think we have been talking about this. We have been, many of us, like those of us who have been at this for at least 30 years, roughly 30 years, we have done this at a reasonably good scale. And those of our senior who have done even 30 years before us, I know some of these. I have been working with Professor Yashpal also quite closely for 15 years. And he has also been doing this in a very wide scale, in a very wide range of topics, understanding science, the fundamentals, basic questioning. I think there is a sort of assumption that just by being aware of something, you can start acting. In that assumption, we don't really take into account there are many other societal pressures. And the system that we are talking about challenging, that system is not lying idle. That system is not at a stage where we had formed some knowledge, and then we have formed an educational package, and we are educating, and the system is at a status quo. It's not like that. It's also evolving. It's continuously evolving and responding. So in a sense, this again gives back the initiative to the individual. I think one of the most important lessons that we have learned is, as he said, not to individualize, but then educating people. I'm not saying people, and this also assumes that many of the issues people are really unaware of. That's not the case. I'll give another small example. Sridharji might know this. We have been sometimes been talking about it. I have been talking with many of the impacted communities in India and Bangladesh and Nepal on this climate impacts and what kind of resilience building, what kind of measures. I have been talking with NFF, the National Fish Workers Forum, for the last 11, 12 years now, on the essential requirement of coastal fish workers. That's what NFF are, of understanding the dangers, understanding the kind of changes, and preparing themselves. Till last year, there was hardly any response. Only after the one after other, the both eastern and western coasts, the cyclones, and the Arabian Sea now has changed actually. Both the temperature and the wind shear patterns have changed. That's why there are 4 major cyclones in 4 consecutive years. Only after getting hit very badly, they approached and they said, now we realize that we need to do. So I think with the kind of pressure that the system has kept people at the bottom continuously for their survival, for their livelihood, for daily needs, basically for their survival, it will not be easy to educate people and expect that bit of education and awareness will translate into action. It will translate into action when at least two things converge. There has to be more. One is some understanding, which is already forming, but the second is also a pressure that they cannot go any further. They cannot really go back any further. So that kind of situation, it is very unfortunate. What I'm saying is, I understand that I am saying that unless people are forced to the wall, they will not fight back in most cases. But that's what is happening because it's not left to people's individual choices. It's not left to a community's individual choices. A community always is not free to choose and do what they want to do because there is a pressure of the larger society. There is a pressure of the larger economy, which destroys this. If you recollect, there are n number of experiments all over the world about local money, local currencies, local economies, local food systems. You don't have any dearth of thousands and thousands of such examples. But what actually prevailed, what the mainstream large dominant factors actually succeeded in steamrolling many of these, actually destroying many of these good things. So it's really not so simple as educating people and getting into the action and dominating the agenda. One is we probably are coming close to that, unfortunately, but when the climate crisis and associated ecological crisis and the economic crisis that is there, which is connected, when they start putting people to the wall, which is already starting to happen, which will happen in a very much larger scale, maybe in another decade or so, and then the realization of the system and what they are doing, which we have a role to play. Definitely we have a role to play, we are playing. So these two combination has to come. Just educating people in a goody-goody sense, giving them some knowledge, some understanding. This has been done for the last 100 years. Just that will not work.
Can I quickly respond? I just want to clarify that I did
Yes.
not mean to say that we just need to educate. In fact, it was one of the first or few things that we need to start doing among a lot of other things that need to be done, and which also includes empowering people. It also includes not just educating them about what they need to do at an individual level, but also educating them on who is to be held accountable. So like you said, it's not just about what actions they can do at a local level, but to understand that it's not just I need to be more conscious of my choices, but also that the grid needs to change. Like I don't need to just switch off the light. The grid needs to change. And for that, why is that not happening? What is required? Who are the people who need to be so those are the linkages that need to be made on a more sort of clear and explicit manner, because people like, everyone here is extremely senior, least of all me, who has this experience. So we speak, you all are speaking from your experience, knowing the structures the way they are. And that is not something that's as explicit currently, right? So those are the connections that the research and civil society needs to make, and not just on science. That's just one thing I wanted to mention.
Yes.
If I can add in support of
yes.
what Ashwini just said, I think the word educate here means all the spectrums of the problem, the biophysical, the technological, the social, the philosophical. I think education in that broad sense is what we are talking about. And I want to also give another example, Soumya, which is more challenging, I find sometimes, the case of water. So water depletion, right? So if you look at the discourse on water, what is the discourse that is both fed by technologists, even hydrologists, to people, by the political system also, is that water going in the river down to the ocean is a waste, and therefore we need to dam and capture and divert all the water for irrigation. And when you run out of rivers to dam, then you turn to, the river is too far away, you turn to groundwater. And then you think that groundwater is a completely different source and you don't need to worry about it affecting anything else when it's actually eating into the base flow of the river and so on, right? But think about a farmer who's been doing 𝗍𝗏𝗃𝗃 for generations and eking out the living, suddenly offered the opportunity of drilling a borewell and doing paddy farming, for which there is also a minimum support price and a subsidized borewell and maybe even solar PV provided free of cost to power the pump. In this context, what is the farmer going to do? And groundwater is something really different from surface water. It's just not possible to see immediately the implications of groundwater pumping. It's a technology that is coming just in the last 50 years. There is no indigenous knowledge on groundwater as against, let's say, indigenous knowledge on fishing or forestry or agriculture itself. And so I think we need to recognize that, again, not to simplify the issue, but to say that education, as Ashwini said, in the whole spectrum. So why we cannot solve the water problem by planting more trees? Why we cannot solve the water problem by building more check dams? which is now the big rage, plant trees and build check dams to solve water problems. The government is pushing groundwater recharge as a solution to groundwater depletion. Why the cause of depletion lies elsewhere, and what therefore we should be doing about it. How should we share water between the upstream and downstream, perhaps differently from pristine rivers, but not so ridiculously as the direction in which we are going, etc. And as Ashwini said, what is the political economy behind dam building or groundwater pumping? What is the fissured technological thinking, the fragmented technological thinking, where we only, build more powerful borewell rigs, but not have the science to predict the implications of drilling? So I think in that sense, I would definitely support Ashwini's point that this wider education, which is, what is interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity about, is science, social science, philosophy. So the value side of the story, all interconnected, is part of education for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Soumya, and I'd like to thank all our speakers for what has been a very thought-provoking and engaging discussion. I think we all leave this discussion with, our understanding of the issues and much more, a much richer understanding of the issues, and with many questions, which hopefully we can then explore further, and which will help us deepen our understanding and hopefully also contribute to the fundamental question which we started out with, which is to stimulate action and movement towards this vital issue of climate change. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their time and their very valuable contributions to this discussion, and of course to our participants for being with us and sharing their comments, their questions. The recording of this discussion will be posted on the Baha'i Chair's YouTube channels and we will share the link with you for you to share with your contacts and those who might be interested.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And thanks to all other panelists for very provoking